Okay, great. Well, today we're celebrating, of course, All Saints Day. And Chris Bradshaw will be on our screen, our big screen. We'll remember Jim Wilson. Jay Whittington is going to share memories of Mort Rochelle. And Greg Scarborough will remember Steve Thurston. So this is those are the presenters today. And before I give the origin of All Saints today, once again, I want to thank HAP for printing up. These are the members who have gone on before. And that's very appropriate, particularly when we consider All Saints Day. We remember those who are no longer with us, but are with us, of course, in spirit. Now, what's the origin of All Saints Day? And it's right interesting. There are several different accounts of it on the internet, but there's one that I think kind of summarizes it, it brings it together. And the title of the article, of course, is Origin of All Saints Day. And All Saints Day can be traced back to the early Christian church and when it was established as a day to remember and to celebrate the martyrs and the saints who had died for their faith. Now, over time, the scope of the holiday was expanded to include martyrs and all faithful Christians who had lived very virtuous lives. And it's a day to recognize the saints' collective witness and express gratitude for the example that they show to us. In the early Christian church, there was a strong emphasis on the veneration of martyrs, the people who had suffered and died. And in the early days, the martyrs were many. There's an account of it in by one of the Roman historians. What Nero did to the early Christians was almost unspeakable. Christians herded together, torn to bits in the arena. And the early Christians meeting underground in the catacombs. So many were martyred during that time. And so there's a strong emphasis on the early Christians who died for their faith. And they were models of exemplary Christian virtue. And the graves are still remembered, the catacombs. They still will lead a guided procession down in some of the catacombs to see what they were really like. Now, the anniversary of the martyrs' death became a day for commemorating their lives and the sacrifices they made on behalf of their faith. Now, in the Western Christian Church, it was Pope Gregory III is often credited with establishing November 1st as the date for All Saints' Day. And the date was chosen to coincide with the dedication of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It was dedicated to all the saints. And it was an attempt to unify the various local celebrations that were kind of cropping up all around it. They needed a universal date to celebrate. Now, the Christian festival of All Saints' Day comes from the conviction that there's a spiritual connection from those people who have died before in heaven and who are presently living on earth. And the common theme is the celebration of family and the memories of those people who have passed. So, who's a saint? And in Corinthians 1:2, couldn't he also call you a saint? Friend, anyone who trusts in Christ alone for salvation is a saint in God's sight. So Paul broadens it to any believer who has faith in Christ and who maintains it. That's the saint. So in a way, by being here, by having faith, we're in effect saints in the eyes of God. So we're going to hear from various people who are going to remember specific members. Now, Chris is going to join us on the screen today, and he's going to remember Jim Wilson. Chris, you with us?
Okay. Can you hear me?
You need your mic.
No. Can you hear me?
Do this.
Hello?
Right now, Chris.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I would love to be there with you all this morning. Our son Harris was married last night in a joyous occasion. So, but let me get right along. Jim Wilson would not like us talking about him this morning. That would be the number one thing. He would say, you know, he was a behind the scenes person. He liked to do things unassumingly. And as a contractor to a contractor, he broke the mold because he would share everything that he knew with you, making you a better person. And Jim worked with me on the, back in 1995, when we did put the elevator in the education building, Jim hand drew the plans for that. And they were the most meticulous plans, easiest to read that I've ever had. And he was just very helpful with what he was doing. He talked me into going on the property committee about 28 years ago. And I sat with him until he literally would interpret because he couldn't hear in the last few years. And he said, you know, Chris, you're going to have to keep doing this. He says, I've got to drop off. But he was one of the nicest people that I think I've ever had the occasion to know. And I have never forgotten him. And every time I go to property committee, I think about Jim. That's you know, he sat on the back row. He was just a special person that always wanted to help you do better. So thank you.
Right.
All right. Thanks. Okay. Next, Jay Whittington. Jay, you want to come up? We've got a mic.
I'm going to Jim Wilson die. I want to go to Jim Wilson die. I didn't know Jim Wilson. Anybody?
I don't remember either.
I didn't remember. Years. I hear you. Just a few years ago. 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bob says 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, Chris, thank you for that. We will never know how many volunteer hours that Jim Wilson put in for this church. It's an untold number. And I might add that we'll never know how many hours of volunteer work that Chris has done for this church as well. Thank you, Chris. By a show of hands, how many of you all have ever heard Mort Rochelle give a Sunday school lesson? Okay, that's about what I kind of figured. Here's how Mort would determine what he was going to talk about. He'd walk in, Salisbury Post under his arm, bring it out. Today's lesson is on lending a hand. And it was the title of the Salisbury, and he taught every lesson with a Salisbury Post in his hand. And he brought it home. He did an excellent job. Much like Bob Lewis always did an excellent job, but Bob always had 3 points. Mort had 1, and he drove it home. He connected it, and it was just an excellent lesson. 12 to 15 minutes we were out. It was great, just a great lesson. Well, actually, Mort's reputation preceded him before I actually knew him. I moved here in 72 and soon became active in the YMCA. And I was talking to the director, Charlie, one day, and Merle or Sandy came in and said, oh, the truck's here with the chlorine. Can you unlock the storage room door? And he said, come on, Jay, we'll go down and unlock them. Mort, through his company, always provided the chlorine for all the pools. And if you'll remember on North Fulton Street, that's where they were located. They had a large outdoor pool and a big indoor pool. Now, to emphasize how important that was, because the chlorine was very expensive, Greg, you'll know this, I think. About every third week in December for years, Bud Mickle would make the phone call. Jay, the Y's not going to make its budget. Can you send us a little money? Checks in the mail, Bud. And he'd go on and call the other 50 people. And sure enough, with all that work, we met the budget. But we would have never met it if it hadn't been for the help of Mort being a great corporate sponsor. So that was how I was introduced to Mort Rochelle, being just a wonderful corporate sponsor of our YMCA. Now you were going to hear from Greg a little bit on Steve Thurston, and I'm going to intertwine a few things here, but Mort and Steve were good friends, and they liked, of all things, they liked to cook. And cook they did, and they often, you could find them down at the Rowan Helping Ministries when it had first started down on North Long Street, the main building. And they roped me into helping them one night, and I walked in, and like I said, they were good friends. They had a pot of soup. I mean, it had to have had 4 or 5 gallons of soup in it, but one of these big steel pots. And one of them had put the pot on the stove, and the other one had turned the heat up. And that gas burner was just cooking away. And it scorched the soup. And when I walked in, they were bickering back and forth and pointing their fingers. They said, you burned the soup. No, you put it on there. Blah, blah. It was worse than 2 10-year-old boys getting ready to have a fist fight. I thought I was going to have to get in the middle of it. Well, anyway, they finally said, because they knew the guests, we had about 35 people coming in that night. And they said, all right, look, here's what we're going to do. Because, I mean, that was the meal. When you take that ladle, don't go down and hit the bottom of that pot, because you'll stir up the scorch and it'll be worse. Just kind of dip it off the top. And we did. That's how we got through with that. But the funny thing was, the first 5 people that came through the door went, who scorched the soup? We served a little bit of it, they ate a little bit of it, and we left a whole lot of soup for the next meeting. So anyway,
Jay, I'll tell you a little bit about Mort.
Yeah.
He was a Mason. I don't know
He-
if he knew about it, but he was in the same Masonic lodge.
Oh, okay.
And I had the honor of one year Mort was homebound.
Yeah.
Yeah. He had acquired a 50-year membership in Flash, and I had the honor of taking it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's
We're
great.
talking about burning soup. Our lodge one year burned 90 gallons of Brunswick stew.
Ooh. But it was all, but it was always good. Little known fact that some of you may not know, but Mort and Steve were great Atlanta Braves fans, as was Bob Lewis. And they would call Bob and go down often for a doubleheader. And they would always go down with coupons.
Oh, come on.
I'm serious. And Bob Lewis, you can vouch for me. This is where they would eat. wherever the best coupon was, they were tight. He was generous, but he was tight as a tick, and Steve was worse. And here they go with the coupons. And you would think that three well-to-do men would go down for a double hitter and maybe spend the night. This was back in the late 70s and 80s. You know, rooms were what, $39? No, they weren't going to spend $39. Back they drove in the middle of the night to Salisbury. Well, they were something. And of course, return meals, they were whoever had the best coupon. My golly. Mort, later in years, developed, and it was a lung problem. I think it must have been lung cancer. Is that, Smitty, you think that's right? I think so. And he stopped coming here. And I called him one weekend and I said, Mort, Sharon's made some of her famous crab bisque. I'd like to bring you some. And he said, oh, that'd be great. And I said, is it okay to come over? And he said, yeah. And I went over for a short visit and gave him the soup. And we chatted for a while. And he said, I've had a good life. He said, I've had great people to work with. He said, the church has been wonderful. This community has embraced us. And whatever the Lord decides, I'm ready to go. He said, I really hurt. I don't feel well. I gave him the suit and we hugged and told him we'd continue our thoughts and prayers with him. And I came home and told Sharon. And the next day my phone rang and it was Mort. He said, Jay, he said, I just want to thank you for your visit and thank you for the soup. He said, I've not had an appetite at all. And he said, that was so good. I ate every drop and just brought tears to my eyes. That was the last time. I said, Mort, if you can, I'd love to bring you some more. It wasn't long after that he passed away. And if there's one thing, gentlemen, that I learned from that is don't wait. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. If there's a friend that you know that's suffering, go see them. Go see them. Don't wait because it could be too late. But Mort was a wonderful person, and I shall miss him. Greg, in Mort and Steve's honor, I've got $30 worth of coupons that you can give me credit for that. And it's right here. Oh, yeah, I'm hooked, aren't I? Bob Lewis, remember, 140.
I'll pass.
There you go. Greg Scarborough is going to remember Steve Thurston.
All right. Well, to begin, I should have had Mort. I shouldn't have gotten Steve. I didn't know Steve as well as I knew Mort. I knew Mort when I moved to Salisbury and started the 5th grade. His son, Bruce, and I were really good friends growing up. And so I spent most of my time over at the Rochelle house growing up. But anyway, Mort was a great guy. Steve, I got to know Steve. He was my dentist, and that was because I think they bartered out back then. My stepfather was an eye, ear, nose, and throat guy, and I think what would happen was he'd go, well, I'll see your people if you'll see my people when they're sick. And so Steve was my dentist for ever and ever until I could afford to go see Bobby Lomax, and that's when I switched and went to Bobby. But Steve was instrumental in so many things around this church that I don't think many people know about. Besides being a cook, he helped finance some of the things that went on over at the basement at the old church. I mean, in the church, and as they said, was very instrumental at the soup kitchen and Roman Helping Ministries. And I've talked to his wife Linda earlier this week about a couple of things. She brought up that here again at one of the breakfasts or luncheons, a fella had a seizure while he was in line. And another man came walking in, and the fella's laying there on the floor. And Steve asked the man, he goes, "Are you here for the lunch?" And he goes, "Yes, I sure am." He goes, "Well, that fella just had some of it, and I don't know if you want to eat it or not." And he used to, and he again, Mort and Steve would do a lot of the cooking here, and cheese grits. We used to have our every man's breakfast, and Steve would make the cheese grits, except he would never put a little bit of cheese in the thing. It was like he was paying for it himself or something. So he didn't want to spend his money. And I guess lastly, that Steve, as I say, was instrumental in so many things. If you ask him for something, he was willing to give it, and without any repercussions. And I remember one last thing I'll say. He loved this church, and he loved the people in this church very, very much. And matter of fact, every time y'all go in the Norfolks over there, the carpet that's on the floor in the Norfolks came from Steve's house. He donated it to the church at some point in time. So remember that. You're walking on the rug that Steve left you.
Greg, when I moved here, when I first joined Rotary, Steve was buying all the groceries and the ladies were cooking. He could buy groceries to feed over 100 men for $50 a week. And I always accused him. I said, "I don't know how you can make 125 banana puddings with only 3 bananas." I promise you that.
That's what we used to say about Leo Wallace at the Holiday Inn with the Roquefort dressing. He just got a piece of Roquefort cheese he would drag through the dressing to give it a little flavor. So that was that.
Greg, maybe you could attest to this, but Steve did not limit his frugality to his daily life. He was a dentist too. And I've been told by several of his older patients, he didn't like to waste money on an anesthetic. I can attest to that. He said, this will take long. And that's what and of course, he never bought any equipment in case of years. And you could just rip on, I think. But he said that was just a waste of time. It wasn't really deep.
You should have just used a large mallet. That would have done just as well. Well, listen, before I open it up for any other comments about any other class members who have passed on, I'd like to mention Al Hoffman. Al was leader for years. He was my next door neighbor for over 40 years. And there's one thing I'll remember about Al, and above all other things, the care he gave to his wife, Lil. Every night, he would be rolling her through the neighborhood on a wheelchair. And he had gotten a special van so that the chair could be put in and Lil in it. And he would take her to work with him every day. He was operating, of course, the furniture plant. So wherever Al went, Lil was with him. And I'll never forget the care that he gave to her. It was an example for everybody in the neighborhood. Even though, she had that terrible crippling disease, he cared for her every minute. And I'll never forget the morning that Lil had died, I guess late in the night, and the ambulance came, to take Lil away. And all of the neighbors came out and just stood silently on the edge of the curb in reverence, for Al and the way he treated his wife, Lil. A very loving relationship. Of course, I'll never forget a funny thing that happened too. He and Lil would be on back screened in porch where they could see out, but you couldn't see in. And so one night I thought, I'll just take some old golf clubs out and see if I can get, hit a few. And I kept hitting the ground behind the ball. And every time I'd miss, I'd hear this burst of laughter from behind the screen. And after about 4 or 5 times, I just summoned as much dignity as I could, picked up the club and the ball, and walked back in the house. They were still laughing. So I'll never.
Steve Thurston was always very affirming to teachers. When they would finish a lesson, he'd say, "That's worth $1." So anyway,
Love it. Well, listen, this wasn't on the schedule, but would anybody else like to make a comment about any of our class members who have passed on before? Anybody?
Give you a short one on Ed Church.
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh. Wow.
Jim Duncan was new and he had to leave town and he asked me to look after his wife. And I was kind of visiting Ed every week or so. So I thought if I took Jim's wife to sing to Ed, that'd be a good deal. It'd be Ed because she could sing so well. Wrong. That is not a good idea. She sang well, but when she got through, Ed decided to thank her by taking her hand and sticking his big fat tongue out and licking her palm.
Oh,
And it just broke my heart that things didn't go well. But I should have known
yeah.
that they weren't going to go well.
I'll never forget Ed's chickens over there. But more than that, we'd hear him every Sunday. But Ed comes to Sunday school one morning with, it was bow tie Sunday. We used to have bow tie Sundays. He took a regular tie and tried to tie it like a bow tie. And yeah.
I don't know if you knew I was a member here, but he offered to help me get a sports coat that looked decent.
Yeah.
Out here on the street. He
That's,
called me. I didn't like his pink house either.
oh, gosh.
Historic Salisbury couldn't stand that chicken coop.
Oh, they could do about it good.
And when I first came, I think he was still, didn't he wear high top tennis shoes? And he'd sit in here and smoke. Right here in the class. And I thought, is this guy from the VA or something?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's stood out.
Well, listen, he was an elected official too for water and conservation. Yeah. Somebody eventually ran against him in 1990. And you know how he would address the political rallies? He would come in a Boy Scout uniform. Really, a Boy Scout uniform. Where he got it, I'll never know. But he'd always come in like that. Oh, boy.
I remember when Ed and Gladys communion one time. The only time I've ever seen this, they toasted each other with the communion.
We take communion today, so I'll remember.
Oh, gosh. Have.
When Mother's Day, kid came in and said, I just called Gladys's his wife, second wife, I just called Gladys's son and said, how about making this a perfect Mother's Day for your mother? And he said, what's that? He said, come get your mother and take her home. Mother's Day. Come get your mother and take her back home.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Well, does anybody else want to remember one of our class members who passed out? Anybody at all? Any other comment?